You don't belong here. The words cut through the warm afternoon air like a sudden drop in temperature, sharp enough to make conversations pause and heads turn across the baseball field where kids in oversized uniforms had been laughing just seconds before. The crack of aluminum bats and the distant hum of traffic now fading into an uneasy silence as Officer Daniel Hayes stepped forward with a hand already resting on his belt. His gaze locked on the woman standing alone near the dugout fence, a woman who didn't look nervous, didn't look confused, didn't even look surprised, just still, composed, as if she had seen this moment coming long before anyone else had noticed her presence. Monica Reed stood there with her hands loosely at her sides, dressed in a simple navy jacket and dark jeans, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention, and yet somehow she had become the center of it all. The kind of stillness that draws eyes without asking for them. The kind of presence that makes people wonder without understanding why. A few parents exchanged glances. One man lowered his phone slightly, as if unsure whether to keep recording. A little boy near home plate stopped mid-swing, his coach's voice trailing off as the tension spread like a quiet ripple through the field. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from this area," Hayes said, louder this time, his tone carrying the weight of authority, the kind that expects immediate compliance. But Monica didn't move, not because she was refusing, but because she was measuring, watching, her eyes steady, focused, not on the crowd, not on the children, but on him, as if she were studying something deeper than the moment itself, something beneath the badge. "I'm just standing," she replied, her voice calm, even, almost soft against the edge in his, and that contrast, that quiet steadiness, only seemed to tighten something in the air. Hayes shifted his stance, glancing briefly at the small group beginning to gather, phones now raised again. Whispers threading through the spectators. "She's been here a while," someone muttered, though no one seemed certain, the narrative building itself in real time, shaped more by assumption than fact. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," Hayes continued, his words firm, rehearsed, as if they had been used many times before in situations just like this, and maybe they had. Maybe that was the problem, because Monica tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she recognized the pattern. "Suspicious," she repeated, not challenging, just clarifying, and for a brief second, something flickered across Hayes' face, something almost like hesitation, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the rigid certainty he wore like armor. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step away," he said, his voice lowering, tightening, and somewhere behind him, a car door slammed, the sound echoing faintly across the lot, unnoticed by most, but not by her. Monica's eyes shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone else to catch, but enough to register, enough to suggest that this moment, this exact moment, was only the beginning of something far bigger than anyone standing on that field could yet understand. And then she looked back at him, steady as ever, and asked, "Officer, are you sure you want to do this?" The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, stretching the moment thin as the sounds of the field seemed to pull back even further, like the world itself was waiting for an answer that had not yet been given. Officer Hayes narrowed his eyes, the faint crease in his forehead deepening, as if her calm tone had unsettled something he could not quite name. People like him were used to resistance that looked loud, emotional, predictable, but this was different. This was quiet, controlled, and that made it harder to push against. "I am giving you a lawful order," he said, each word measured, deliberate, as though reinforcing the ground beneath his authority. But even as he spoke, a few more phones lifted in the crowd, small glowing screens capturing every second, parents shifting uneasily, unsure whether to step in or step back. A woman near the bleachers whispered, "Something feels off," but no one moved. No one wanted to be the one to interrupt what was unfolding, because it already felt bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Monica exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but patience, the kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly how situations like this tend to play out. Her eyes briefly scanning the field again, the children, the coaches, the families, all caught in a moment they did not ask for, and then back to him, always back to him. "I understand what you are saying," she replied, her voice steady, respectful, but there was a weight beneath it, something firm, something unshaken. But I have not done anything wrong. And there it was, the line that should have ended it, the line that in a different world might have been enough. But Hayes shifted again, his stance tightening as if her refusal to escalate only made him more certain that he needed to. We have had reports, he repeated, though the words sounded thinner this time, less certain, like they were being said more for the crowd than for her, because now the crowd was part of it, their presence pressing in from all sides, their silence louder than any argument. A teenage boy leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Why is she not leaving?" And his friend replied, "Why is he still pushing?" Questions hanging in the air with no clear answers. Monica's phone vibrated again in her pocket, a soft, almost invisible detail, but it happened again. And then again, consistent, persistent, like something or someone was trying to reach her. Hayes noticed it this time, his eyes flicking downward for just a second, and that was enough to shift his focus. "Do you mind taking your hands out where I can see them clearly?" he said, not aggressive, but firmer now, stepping closer, closing the space between them by a few feet, close enough that the tension felt physical even without a single raised voice. And still, she did not react the way he expected. No sudden movement, no panic, just that same composed presence, as if she had already calculated every possible outcome and was waiting for him to arrive at the one he could not yet see. "Officer," she said again, softer this time, almost like a warning wrapped in calm. "There is still time to handle this differently." And somewhere beyond the parking lot, faint but growing, the low hum of approaching engines began to rise, unnoticed by most, but not by her, never by her, because she was not just standing there, she was waiting. The sound grew clearer now, no longer just a distant hum, but a defined presence cutting through the quiet edges of the moment, engines rolling steadily closer from beyond the parking lot. And while most of the people gathered around the field remained focused on the standoff in front of them, a few heads began to turn, curiosity pulling their attention towards something they could not yet see. Officer Hayes did not notice at first, his focus locked entirely on Monica, on the way she stood without shifting, without breaking, as if time itself moved differently for her, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit, because in his experience, people either complied or resisted. They moved, they argued, they explained, but they did not just stand there and wait. Not like this, not with that kind of certainty in their eyes. "I am not going to ask again," he said, his voice tightening, the words sharper now, less measured, as though the situation slipping outside his control was something he could force back into place with enough authority. But even as he spoke, the subtle shift in the atmosphere was becoming harder to ignore. The low rumble now accompanied by the faint crunch of tires over gravel, closer, deliberate, and Monica heard it. Not with surprise, but with recognition, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who is arriving and why. Her gaze did not break from his, but something in her posture changed, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that the moment he thought he controlled was already moving beyond him. "Officer Hayes," she said, and the use of his name caught him off guard for half a second, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he masked it again, because he had not introduced himself, not directly, not to her, and yet she said it as if it had always been there, like she had known it long before this moment ever began. "You still have a chance to step back," she continued, her tone unchanged, calm, steady, almost patient, and that patience began to feel less like compliance and more like warning, the kind that people often ignore until it is too late. Hayes glanced briefly over his shoulder now, just a quick check, and that was when he saw it, two dark SUVs turning into the lot. With a precision that did not match the casual flow of a neighborhood park, their movement controlled, purposeful, not rushing, not hesitating, just arriving exactly when they meant to. A few people in the crowd stepped aside instinctively, their phones lowering slightly as confusion replaced curiosity. "What is that?" someone whispered, but no one answered, because no one knew. Not yet. Hayes turned back to Monica, his expression shifting, not fully uncertain, but no longer as solid as it had been moments ago. "Do you know anything about that?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, and for the first time, she allowed the smallest hint of something to surface, not a smile, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, as if the next step in a sequence had finally arrived. Yes, she said simply, and the word landed heavier than anything else spoken so far. The SUVs came to a smooth stop along the edge of the field, engines still running, doors remaining closed for a brief, deliberate pause. A pause that stretched the tension tighter than before, because now everyone was watching, not just her, not just him, but whatever was about to happen next. And then the first door opened, slow, controlled, a man stepping out in a dark suit, his posture straight, his gaze scanning the scene with practiced clarity, followed by another, and another, each movement precise, coordinated, not chaotic, not reactive, but intentional. And Monica finally shifted her eyes away from Hayes, just for a moment, just enough to meet the gaze of the man approaching, a recognition passing between them without a single word. And in that silent exchange, the balance of power that had defined the last few minutes began to tilt, not abruptly, not loudly, but undeniably, because the moment Hayes thought he was enforcing something had already become something else entirely, something he was no longer controlling, and deep down, whether he understood it or not, he could feel it slipping. The door closed behind the last man who stepped out of the second vehicle, and for a brief moment the entire field seemed to hold its breath, not because anyone had been told to stop, but because something in the air had shifted so completely that even the children felt it, their movements slowing, their voices fading into whispers as the men in suits began walking forward with a calm that did not match the tension around them. It was not hurried, not aggressive, just precise, the kind of movement that comes from people who already know exactly what they are stepping into. Officer Hayes straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back as if trying to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip, his hands still resting near his belt. But now there was a hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty that had not been there before. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he called out, his voice firm but no longer as steady. And the lead agent, a tall man with a composed expression and eyes that missed nothing, did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued walking until he was close enough that the space between them felt intentional, controlled. Then he stopped, his gaze shifting briefly from Hayes to Monica, a subtle nod passing between them, one that spoke volumes without a single word, and then back to Hayes. "We will take it from here," the agent said, his tone even, not raised, not confrontational, but absolute. The kind of statement that does not ask for permission, it assumes it. Hayes blinked, just once, as if recalibrating. "This is an active situation," he replied, trying to hold his ground. "I have a report of suspicious behavior." And as he said it, the words sounded smaller than before, less certain, like they were losing weight the moment they left his mouth. The agent did not react to the explanation, did not argue, did not challenge. He simply reached into his jacket and presented identification with a calm confidence that drew the attention of everyone watching. The movement was smooth, practiced, and though the details were not clear from a distance, the reaction it created was unmistakable. Hayes' eyes dropped to the badge, scanning, processing, and then lifting again. But this time there was a change, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. The certainty that had defined him minutes ago was no longer there, replaced by something quieter, something closer to doubt. Behind him, one of the other officers shifted his stance, glancing between Hayes and the agents, sensing the shift even if he did not fully understand it. The crowd leaned in, phone steady, capturing every second, because now it was no longer just about a woman standing near a field. It was about something else, something bigger, something that was unfolding in real time without explanation. The lead agent turned slightly toward Monica, his posture softening just a fraction. "Ma'am," he said, respectful, controlled. And in that single word, the entire dynamic changed, because it was not just a greeting, it was recognition, acknowledgement, and for the first time since this began, the roles that had seemed so fixed started to reverse. Monica nodded once, calm as ever, as if this was simply the next step in a process that had already been set in motion long before anyone here realized it. Hayes watched this exchange, his jaw tightening, trying to piece together what he was seeing, because it did not align with the version of events he had constructed in his mind. "Who is she?" he asked, the question coming out sharper than intended, and the agent looked back at him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that felt heavier than either. a brief pause settling between them before he answered. She is the reason we are here. And the words landed differently than anything else that had been said. Not loud, not forceful, but definitive, like a line drawn quietly in the sand. And as the weight of that statement settled over the field, over the officers, over the watching crowd, the reality of the situation began to take shape in a way that could no longer be ignored, because whatever this was, whatever had just begun to unfold, it was never about loitering, and it was never as simple as he had believed. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a moment no one spoke, not the crowd, not the officers, not even the children who had unknowingly become witnesses to something far beyond a simple afternoon practice. Officer Hayes felt it first in the silence. That subtle shift where control no longer felt like something he held, but something he was losing, inch by inch, without fully understanding how it had slipped away. The reason you are here, he repeated under his breath, as if saying it again might make it clearer, might restore some version of certainty, but it did not, because when he looked at Monica now, he was no longer seeing just a woman standing near a fence. He was seeing the calm center of something much larger, something structured, deliberate, something that had layers he had not considered. The lead agent took a small step forward, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same controlled authority, but now there was context behind it. Officer Hayes, correct, he said, not asking, just confirming. And Hayes nodded slightly, his posture stiff. We are going to need you to step back, the agent continued, and allow us to handle this situation from here. The phrasing was careful, professional, but there was no ambiguity in it, no room for interpretation. It was not a suggestion, and that was the moment the realization began to settle deeper, because Hayes understood authority. He understood command, and what stood in front of him now was not something he could override with volume or presence. Behind him, one of the other officers shifted again, lowering his radio slightly, eyes fixed on the interaction, sensing that whatever line had been crossed was not one they could simply step back over. The crowd leaned in closer, their whispers quieter now, more focused, as if they too could feel the gravity of what was unfolding. I was responding to a call, Hayes said, his voice not as sharp as before, but still holding on to its structure. I have a responsibility to follow through. And for a second, it sounded almost like justification, not to them, but to himself. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. And we have a responsibility to ensure that what follows is handled correctly, he replied. And there it was again, that subtle but powerful shift in language, not confrontation, not accusation, but correction, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. Monica remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but now the space around her felt different, no longer isolated, no longer exposed. It felt supported, reinforced by something invisible but undeniable. She reached slowly into her jacket, not suddenly, not in a way that triggered alarm, just deliberate, controlled, and for the briefest second Hayes tensed, instinct overriding reason. But the agents did not move, did not react, because they already knew. She pulled out a small, simple credential holder, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, and held it at her side, not even presenting it yet, just letting it exist in the space between them. And that alone was enough to shift everything again, because now there was no denying that this moment had never been what it seemed. Hayes watched, his eyes fixed on that small object, the final piece of a puzzle he had not realized he was stepping into. What is this? He asked, quieter now, not demanding, not commanding, just asking. And Monica looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more controlled, far more grounded. It is the part you missed, she said, her voice calm, steady, and in that answer was everything, not just about this moment, but about the pattern that had led to it, the assumptions, the conclusions drawn too quickly, the authority applied without full understanding. And as the weight of her words settled in, the field, the crowd, the officers, all stood in that same suspended moment where the truth was no longer hidden, just not yet fully spoken, and Hayes, for the first time since this began, did not have the next move. The space between them seemed to stretch, not in distance, but in meaning, as if everything that had just been said was still settling into place, reshaping the reality that only minutes ago had felt so certain. Officer Hayes did not reach for the credential. He did not interrupt. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on it, because something in the way Monica held it told him that this was not a piece of identification meant to prove anything to him. It was something that existed regardless of whether he understood it or not. The lead agent shifted his stance slightly, stepping just enough to align himself beside Monica rather than in front of her. A subtle repositioning that spoke louder than any explanation. It was not protection, it was acknowledgement. "Ma'am," the agent said again, his tone respectful. "Do you want to proceed here or move this somewhere more controlled?" And the question itself carried weight, because it assumed authority, it assumed decision, it assumed that whatever came next would follow her lead. Not his, not the officer's, but hers. Monica glanced briefly at the field, at the children who were still watching, at the parents who had stopped pretending this was normal, at the quiet tension that had replaced what should have been a simple afternoon, and then back to the agent. "We will finish it here," she said, her voice calm, deliberate, and final. And that was the moment the structure of the situation fully inverted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Hayes felt it in the way the air changed, in the way the agent nodded without hesitation, in the way the other officers behind him shifted their attention, no longer looking to him for direction, but waiting, uncertain, for what would come next. Monica finally lifted the credential slightly, not thrusting it forward, not presenting it like a challenge, just enough for the agent to acknowledge. And he did, a small confirming nod, before turning his attention back to Hayes. "Officer, you were responding to a report," he said, his tone even, controlled. "We understand that." And for a brief moment, it sounded like validation, like a bridge being offered. But then the next words followed, measured, precise. "But this individual is operating under federal authorization." And the sentence did not rise, did not emphasize itself. It simply existed. And in that existence it carried more weight than anything else spoken so far. Hayes blinked again, slower this time, processing, recalibrating. Because the narrative he had built, the assumptions he had acted on, they did not fit. Inside that sentence, they could not. Federal authorization. He repeated, quieter now, and Monica met his gaze, not with accusation, not with anger, but with clarity. "I am here to evaluate field readiness," she said, her voice steady, "including how situations like this are handled." And the words landed with a different kind of impact, not explosive, not confrontational, but revealing, like a curtain being pulled back on something that had been in motion long before he arrived. The crowd shifted again, a murmur passing through them as pieces began to connect, phones still recording, but now capturing something far more significant than anyone had expected. One of the parents whispered, "This was planned," and another replied, "No, this was a test." And in that quiet exchange, the truth began to take shape not just for Hayes, but for everyone watching, because this was not random, it was not coincidence. It was not just an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was something designed to observe, to reveal, to measure. Hayes felt his stance loosen slightly, not because he chose to, but because the ground beneath it had changed. "You were saying this was intentional," he said, and Monica did not hesitate. "I am saying that how you respond when you believe no one important is watching," she paused, just long enough for the words to settle, "tells us everything." And in that moment, the weight of what had just unfolded became impossible to ignore, because it was no longer about her standing there, and it was no longer about him enforcing anything. It was about what had been exposed, quietly, clearly, and in front of everyone, without a single raised voice. The words did not need to be repeated. They settled into the space like something permanent, something that could not be undone simply by stepping back or changing tone. And for the first time since he had walked onto that field, Officer Hayes felt the full weight of the moment pressed down on him, not as pressure from others, but as the realization of what had already been set in motion before he even arrived. He looked around, not quickly, not nervously, but deliberately, taking in the faces that had been watching, the phones still raised, the children who no longer understood the game they had been playing, the parents who now saw something far more serious unfolding in front of them, and then back to Monica, who had not changed, not in posture, not in expression, not in tone, as if everything that had just been revealed was simply confirmation of what she already knew would happen. The lead agent remained beside her, not speaking, not interrupting, allowing the silence to do its work, because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from what is said next, but from what has already been understood. Hayes cleared his throat slightly, a small, human gesture that broke the stillness just enough to show that something inside him had shifted. If this was an evaluation, he began, his voice no longer carrying the same rigid authority, but something more measured, more careful, then I was not informed. And it was not an accusation, not fully, it was closer to confusion, to an attempt to regain footing in a situation that no longer followed the rules he expected. Monica nodded once, acknowledging the statement without softening it. You were not supposed to be informed, she said, her voice steady. And in that answer was the entire point. The reason this had unfolded the way it did, because preparation changes behavior, awareness alters decisions. And what they were measuring here could not exist if he knew he was being watched. The agent beside her added quietly, real conditions, real responses, and the simplicity of that phrase carried more weight than any long explanation could have. Hayes let out a slow breath, not exaggerated, just enough to release the tension that had built up in ways he had not even noticed. His hand dropped fully away from his belt now, no longer resting there as if ready to assert control, because control was no longer his to assert, not in this moment, not in this space. And what exactly were you evaluating? He asked, and this time the question came without edge, without challenge, just a need to understand. Monica took a small step forward, closing the distance slightly, not to confront, but to meet him where he stood now, not as an officer asserting authority, but as a man facing the outcome of his choices, decision-making under assumption. She said, each word clear, deliberate. How quickly you escalate based on perception, how you interpret presence without context, how you apply authority when there is no immediate threat. And as she spoke, the field seemed to quiet even further, because those words were not just for him. They were for everyone listening, everyone recording, everyone who had ever witnessed a moment like this and wondered what drove it. Hayes listened, really listened now, not waiting to respond, not preparing to push back, but absorbing, because the framework she was laying out was not one he could dismiss. It was structured, intentional, and uncomfortably accurate. And what did I do? He asked. And there was something different in that question, something more vulnerable than anything he had said before, not weakness, but awareness, the beginning of it. Monica held his gaze, not looking away, not softening, but not condemning either, just presenting truth without decoration. You saw a person standing still, she said, and you decided that stillness meant suspicion. You saw no immediate threat, and you created one through assumption. You chose control before understanding. And the words were not loud, not harsh, but they landed with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The crowd shifted again, quieter now, not whispering, not reacting loudly, just listening, because what was happening in front of them had moved beyond a single interaction. It had become something else, something reflective, something that forced a pause not just in action, but in thought. Hayes stood there, absorbing it, not interrupting, not defending, because for the first time, there was nothing immediate to defend against, only something to understand. And in that stillness, the same stillness he had questioned minutes ago, the real shift began to take place. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, filled with something that could not be rushed or redirected, because what had been said was no longer just part of the moment. It had become the moment itself. Officer Hayes remained still, not out of defiance, not out of uncertainty, but because movement now felt unnecessary, almost inappropriate, like stepping too quickly would disrupt something that needed to be understood before anything else could happen. The weight of Monica's words did not press down on him all at once. It settled gradually, piece by piece, each sentence finding its place in the sequence of what had just unfolded. And for the first time, he began to replay it, not as a series of actions he had taken, but as a chain of decisions he had made, decisions that now looked different when viewed through the lens she had laid out. The crowd remained quiet, but their presence was no longer passive. It was attentive, focused, as if they were witnessing Something that extended beyond this field, beyond this afternoon. Something that reflected patterns they had seen before but never heard explained this clearly. One of the parents slowly lowered their phone, not because the moment had lost importance, but because it had gained meaning. The lead agent glanced briefly at Monica, a silent check, and she gave a small nod, signaling that what needed to be said had been said, at least for now. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that carried more significance than any of his earlier steps, because it was not about asserting space, it was about adjusting within it. I followed procedure, he said finally, not with the force of defense, but with the tone of someone trying to reconcile two versions of the same reality. The one he believed he acted within and the one now being presented to him. Monica did not interrupt, did not correct him immediately. She allowed the statement to exist, because understanding does not come from being shut down. It comes from being allowed to see where the line begins to shift. Procedure is a framework, she said after a moment, her voice steady, measured. But how you apply it defines the outcome. And there it was again, not contradiction, not dismissal, but refinement, the kind that does not remove responsibility, it clarifies it. Hayes nodded slowly, almost unconsciously, because that distinction, simple as it sounded, carried implications he could not ignore. Behind him, one of the younger officers glanced at the ground, then back up, his posture no longer rigid, his expression thoughtful, as if he too was processing something he had never been asked to examine before. The field, once filled with movement and noise, had become something else entirely, a space of reflection, of quiet confrontation, not between people, but between assumptions and reality. Monica took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, allowing the moment to breathe, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about what came after. What happens next is not about punishment, she said, her tone unchanged, but carrying a different kind of weight now. It is about accountability and growth. And the words did not land as a threat. They landed as direction, as a path forward that did not erase what had happened, but did not freeze it in place either. Hayes met her gaze again, and this time there was no resistance in it. No attempt to assert control or redirect the situation. Just acknowledgement. The beginning of understanding. I see that now, he said, quietly, and though the words were simple, they marked a shift more significant than anything that had come before, because recognition, once it arrives, cannot be undone. The lead agent stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to transition, to move the moment from realization into resolution. We will follow up through the appropriate channels, he said, his tone professional, steady, and Hayes nodded, not because he was being told to, but because he understood that this was no longer something to resist, it was something to accept. The crowd began to shift again, slowly, quietly, not breaking into noise or reaction, but dispersing with a sense that what they had just witnessed was not just an incident. It was a lesson, one that did not need to be repeated out loud because it had already been seen, already been felt. And as the field began to return, slowly, to its normal rhythm, the echo of what had happened remained, not in sound, but in awareness, in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones that explode, but the ones that reveal. The field did not return to what it was, not completely, because once something is seen clearly, it does not disappear just because the moment passes. It stays, quiet but present, like a shift in the air that no one can fully explain but everyone can feel. The children slowly resumed their positions, bats lifted again, gloves adjusted, but their movements were softer now, more aware, as if they had witnessed something that did not belong in their world but would stay with them anyway. The parents spoke in lower voices, no longer whispering in confusion, but reflecting in understanding, glancing back occasionally at the space near the dugout where it had all unfolded, as if trying to make sense of how something so simple had revealed something so much deeper. Officer Hayes stood for a moment longer, not because he had nowhere to go, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like avoiding what had just happened, and he was no longer in a place where avoidance made sense. His posture had changed, not weakened, but grounded, stripped of the urgency that had driven him before, replaced by something steadier, something more thoughtful. He looked once more at Monica, who was now speaking quietly with the lead agent, their conversation calm, controlled, already moving forward, already beyond the moment that had just reshaped everything. And in that image, there was no anger, no triumph, just purpose. The kind that does not need to prove itself because it already knows where it stands. Hayes took a slow breath, then another, not to steady himself, but to acknowledge what had settled inside him, because what she had said was not just about him. It was about a pattern, a way of seeing, a way of deciding. And for the first time, he recognized that changing that pattern would not come from ignoring it. It would come from facing it, understanding it, and choosing differently the next time. The agent's voice carried faintly as he concluded their exchange. "We will be in touch." Professional, measured, and Monica gave a small nod, her attention shifting briefly back toward the field, toward the people who had witnessed it all, her expression unchanged, but her presence leaving something behind that could not be measured in reports or evaluations, something quieter, something lasting. She turned slightly, preparing to leave, but paused just long enough to look back at Hayes one final time, not to judge, not to remind, but simply to acknowledge. And in that look there was a clarity that needed no explanation, no follow-up, no correction, just understanding. Hayes met her gaze and nodded once, not as an officer, not as someone asserting anything, but as someone who had seen something clearly and could not unsee it. The SUVs remained for only a moment longer before the doors closed and the engines carried them away, smooth and controlled, just as they had arrived, leaving behind a field that looked the same but felt different, because what had happened there was not loud. It was not chaotic. It did not demand attention with force. It revealed something with precision, something that did not need to be repeated to be remembered. And as the game resumed, and the sun continued its slow descent over the outfield fence, the lesson remained, quiet but permanent, because he thought he was enforcing the law. But that day, he learned something far more important. The law is not just what you carry, it is how you choose to see the people in front of you.